Hello, you're watching the Great Canadian Bible here, and today we have another Quebec provincial election forecast. Now, before we begin, once again, shout out all my channel members. I really appreciate you guys doing for me. And if you guys want to support my channel, by all means, go down in the link in the description and join the channel. Be a member yourself. If you can't afford that, I understand. It's trying times. And by all means, just do your basic YouTube things. Like, share, subscribe, and comment below. With no further ado, let us begin. So, there's been a growing movement in Quebec over the last year, I would say now, where the Parti Quebecois has been steadily gaining ground since the 2022 election. It really started picking up about last spring when Plamondon was gaining some traction in Parliament. He had just won his seat in the election on a nail-biter race, arguably only one because the Quebec Solidaire candidate had to be withdrawn for unrelated reasons. Some scandal of some kind that I forget off the top of my head. People in the comments below will probably correct or say what it was. But it doesn't really matter why that scandal withdrew that Quebec Solidaire candidate. What matters is Plamondon won. And since then, he's proven himself quite a strong critic to Legault. Much stronger than Dubois or his co-leader. I'm not sure who she is. I think it was a girl. But I don't know. Her name's not on the map, so I don't remember her. I don't pay that. You have to forgive me. And the Liberals have been basically leaderless after their leader resigned following 2022, naturally, because they lost quite poorly. So Plamondon's really been the only major opposition leader, and he's decided to oppose the CAQ on a lot of really core issues to Quebec. And it's quite interesting. If you've watched previous videos in this series, I will have hashed on this a little bit, but I'll just rehash once again for any new viewers or just people who haven't seen one of these in a couple months, so rehashes are always decent. The Parti Quebecois is contesting the CAQ not on strictly fiscal grounds, not on strictly social grounds, not on strictly cultural grounds, but more as a vibe, if that makes sense. And not as in like I'm not saying vibe as in a negative sense. Whenever you hear me say the word vibe on this channel, period, I am not saying that derisively. I think vibe is actually quite important of a thing in politics, and people really dismiss it more than they should. But Plamondon has been really pushing back in CAQ on the vibe, if you will, the collective confluence of those three things, but not any individual policies here or there. He can point to some like the Legault canceling the highway extension around Quebec City, or the immigration issues but being higher than the CAQ promised the numbers would be. You could point to specific issues, but those are just flashpoints. They're little incidences. Those are not what is causing this shift. They're the things that have precipitated this shift. If you will, imagine the spark that lights off gunpowder. The spark isn't what causes the explosion. It's just the thing that enabled that to happen. The explosives were already there. So what are these explosives for Quebec? Well, naturally, the explosives are the underlying core reality that Francophones are a minority in North America, and that likely will not change any time in the future. And specifically, even in that, the Quebecois and other Canadian Francophones in general are a very specific subgroup of French. They're their own little culture. Now, they're similar to other French people, such as people from France itself, but they're distinct. Just like how Anglo-Canadians are distinct from the British or distinct from the Americans. So there is a certain concern there, and a reasonable concern that a lot of Quebecois nationalists have, that they're in trouble. A lot of things going on, high immigration, low fertility, etc., are direct concerns. And these aren't concerns because, say, immigration is high in and of itself. It's not a direct concern because fertility is low in and of itself. The concern is the sustainability and the survivability of the Quebecois as a nation. And where this powder keg creates is the dichotomy between the CAQ and the Parti Quebecois on philosophy of independence. Both parties eventually see separation as good. And the easiest way to summarize the difference between the two parties is the Parti Quebecois think we need to separate now, fix our finances later, and the CAQ think we need to fix our finances first, separate later. That is the only difference between the two of them. You can point to specific policies or you can point to specific ideas, but those are surface level. Those don't really matter. The exact economic position of the Parti Quebecois, the exact economic position of the CAQ are completely irrelevant to where they are in politics. The CAQ is not losing because people in Quebec are unhappy with their economic position. The Parti Québécois is not gaining ground because people in Quebec are really, really into their economic policies. What it boils down to is Plamondon is telling people that I have a solution to your concerns. The concern being, is Quebec being encroached on by the rest of North America? Not even just Canada, because the US is quite of a strong cultural presence too, especially to anyone who's used the internet. If you are a young Quebecer, you almost certainly know what I mean by that. And Plamondon is trying to sell a genuine offer. Now, is that a good offer? That's up to voters to decide. I am a partisan myself, but I try not to opine in these videos. Not that I really have a strong opinion on Quebec politics either way, because I don't vote in it. But, anyways, so that's the situation you have in Quebec. That's the circumstances. But you see a lot of people looking at Quebec and looking at the politics here, and their interpretation is of recent trends. Like if we pop up here with our spreadsheet of votes, you can see here the last little bit from February 12th to, this should say May 13th. Apologies, but I'll update that later. Just this May 13th. You can see here, this is 1.7 or 1.9, no, yeah, 1.7 point increase of liberals. And some people have come to the conclusion, oh, the liberals are rebounding. Oh, maybe the CAQ was a flash in the pan. And then I myself, if you follow myself on Twitter, I sort of indulged that thinking momentarily. And I don't delete my tweets usually, so I'm not, that tweet probably still exists somewhere. You find it. But I think that interpretation is wrong. Now, in some sense, it's kind of fun to say that as like as a joking manner, but objectively speaking, I think that interpretation is entirely wrong. I don't think the Liberal Party is rebounding per se. What we're seeing here is the inverse to what we saw in 2018 and 2022, in that the Parti Québécois was pushed down to the fringes, almost wiped out, only a couple seats surviving. And most people in the rest of Canada were saying, oh, the Parti Québécois is dead, Quebec separatism is dead. But in reality, the Parti Québécois was actually the main opposition party to the CAQ the entire time. Because, as I've outlined in previous videos, they're the only party that is actually competitive. You could say all 4 regions in Quebec. We go back here, we see here, they get 23% in Montreal, or 30.6 in the suburbs of Montreal, 37 in Quebec City, 35 in the rest of Quebec. They're competitive in every region. Keeping here, who else do we have? Well, the Liberals are quite strong in Montreal. They're okay in their suburbs. They're horrendous in Quebec City, and they're terrible in the rest of Quebec. The Quebec Solidaire is okay in Montreal and pretty much flat everywhere else. The CAQ is quite strong in rural Quebec. The suburbs of Montreal, they're good in Quebec City. They're a little weak in Montreal. And that weakness in Montreal is the fact CAQ is slightly more fiscally right-wing. Not a lot. Don't think the CAQ is like some arch like neoliberal party. They're not. But they're slightly more right-wing on economics than I would say the Parti Québécois is. And because of this distribution, and I predict that this distribution will continue, I don't think the Liberals in any time soon, especially with some of the people I've seen speculated for leadership for the Liberals, I don't think that's going to change. And the reason being, the Liberal Party, in a sense, is kind of in a self-filling cycle where they are the only party willing to speak for the minorities in Quebec, particularly the Anglo minority in Quebec. So they get scapegoated or perhaps typecast as the Anglo party in Quebec, which makes it very difficult for them to win ground in the rest of Quebec among Francophones when this kind of concern and alienation is the forefront of people's minds. We're seeing this too in other polls. It's not just these vote intention polls, desire for separation is increasing. Now, I would say right now, 2024, the referendum would still fail, but assuming in 2026 Plamondon wins and he does follow through with his referendum promise, and that referendum promise happens in, say, 2028, a lot could change in 4 years, especially if you have an entire provincial government campaigning for it for 2 years and an election campaign about it for several months. So that could easily change, but right now I would say it's the minority position, though it is growing. And while that is growing, and while this kind of alienation and concern among the Quebecois is quite high, at the highest point it's been since probably the 90s, there's not much room for the Liberals to make ground among Francophones. They could probably monopolize the Anglophone and Allophone population if they do really well. Maybe they could pull out 30 seats, give or take, if they do really well in Montreal. Like they could probably pick up, just eyeballing it here, like maybe like 5-6 more. They do really, really well. But that's only 5 or 6 more. And that I'm willing to say that's pretty close to their ceiling. It's hard to imagine them doing somewhere else. They would require a categorically different approach from the party, which I just don't see happening. I could be wrong on this, of course, but it would require the party to completely pivot and somehow satisfy this underlying concern and alienation of the Francophones without alienating their base. Because if they switch to massaging the Francophones and the process lose the Anglophones, it's not the same party anymore. I suspect we're going to see here, and we're going to see, at least for the foreseeable future, I mean, things could change. The CAQ didn't exist 20 years ago. But what I foresee happening is the Parti Quebecois and the CAQ will keep alternating power, at least for the near, let's say 20 years time horizon, until Quebec leaves the country or until desire for separation evaporates. I don't know why it would evaporate, but if it did, that situation might change. And how I think that this is going to look is it's going to look like alternating crash and boom for these parties. So the CAQ will go from like 90 seats they have right now to 20. And then say 2034, they go from 20 or 10 to 70 or 80 again. And it will keep looking like that. Because what we're going to see is right now, look at this, right? Look at all of this part of rural Quebec here, around here, the suburbs of Montreal, up here. I don't want to count it, but there's probably like 20 seats that the Parti Québécois are winning by 5 points or less over the CAQ. And the Liberals and the Quebec Solidaire and the Conservatives are so far behind, they're irrelevant. And if those 20 seats just flip back and forth, you immediately go from Parti Québécois majority government to minority. And if a few more seats flip, because again, a bunch of these over here, we're only looking at the 5 to 10% margin. Not a huge lead. Like a lot of rural Quebec could just boom, flip overnight. Look here, you look back to December, the difference between December and this should say May 13th, so approximately 4 or 5 months, the CAQ lost 3 points and the Parti Québécois gained 6. So that 9-point swing in rural Quebec caused the Parti Québécois to gain 24 seats and the CAQ to lose 21. Like, that's the numbers we're talking about. And then Quebec City itself, you see 2 seats the CAQ lost, and the suburbs of Montreal, they went from having 18 seats to 5. And in suburbs of Montreal, we went from seeing 32 to 28 and 26.7 to 30.6. So about an 8-point swing again. Yeah, 8-point swing. Well, the CAQ lost 4 points, the Parti Québécois gained those 4 points. So we're in a really narrow band here. And I don't think we'll see it change dramatically more. I think you could probably see the Parti Québécois pull out to 36, 37, 38, maybe 39%, largely drawing from the CAQ, possibly some other parties too. And they could be in a situation where you only have a few odd CAQ seats left. You might have Legault's seat here, you might have eastern part of Saguenay here, you might have Hull here, You might have a couple others maybe that hold out that are just because of the power of incumbency, like a really strong incumbent. But it's hard to say. We don't really know until that happens because that's the kind of thing that's really hard to estimate. Like I can't remember the name of this guy, but this guy here, he just dominated his race in 2022 when he should have by all means lost. He didn't account for the fact that he was a strong incumbent, and he was a really strong incumbent. He won by quite a large margin. So we're seeing this kind of interesting situation form here where it looks like Quebec is a 4-5 party system, but in reality, you just have two, maybe three parties who just win a few odd seats here or there. Or the case of Liberals, they just win one particular language category, and then the rest of it is nothing. It's just two parties. It is a two-party system that is dressed up to look like a 4, maybe 5-party system. And the reason why I say this is there's very few ridings that are competitive by even 3 parties. You have like a few ridings here in like central Quebec or North Montreal or Laval that are 3-party races, and if some of the suburbs like over here are like 3-ish party races, but that's basically it. The only other major 3-party races are around the suburbs of Quebec City. And that's kind of dubious because I'm not 100% sure if the Conservative Party will actually have much staying power, but it might. So what does that mean here? So we have this kind of duopoly that appears to be emerging and will likely be a boom and bust duopoly. Okay. Does that mean Quebec's going to separate? Well, I don't want to stake anything to that because it's kind of hard to tell, but it seems very likely to me that a referendum will be tabled. I suspect Plamondon's going to win a majority of some flavor at this point. It'd be very challenging for Legault to turn it around. This might be one of the rare circumstances where replacing the leader might be the correct choice for the CAQ, though I don't know who they would replace him with. That would be, I couldn't even speculate on that. I just don't know enough about the internal party dynamics of the CAQ to bother trying to speculate, but that would be really the only thing I could think of that would meaningfully turn this around if Plamondon doesn't screw up. Yes, you could say it's 2 years from the election, and yes, as I just outlined, a bunch of these ridings are quite close, so it wouldn't take very much to turn it around. But at the same token, it's the underlying details are trending in the wrong direction for the CAQ. If independent support keeps gaining ground, it's almost impossible to imagine the Parti Quebecois losing ground. If people want to separate, they're going to vote for the party promising a referendum, not going to vote for anyone else. So it seems increasingly likely that we will see this. Now, the corollary to that, and I've seen some people say this, and I don't think it's an entirely wrong thought, that if the support for independence becomes so high, it could, in a situation, potentially destroy the CAQ by basically centrifuging out the elements. The separatists will leave to the Parti Quebecois, the federalists will leave to liberals, and it will undo the last 10, 15 years of Quebec politics and reset it to the early 2000s equivalent, though this time with a weaker Liberal Party and a stronger Parti Quebecois. And I don't think that's entirely outlandish. Like, if that happened, that wouldn't be that surprising. I'm not expecting it because I don't think we will see the Liberals really be able to capitalize on it. It might cause some ground gained for the Liberals. It might cause the CAQ to become pretty minor. But at the end of the day, when Quebecers are tired of Plamondon's done enough screw-ups or whatever in government and they don't want him anymore, they're going to want to vote for a different party. And that party will have to be the CAQ because the Liberals just don't work with rural francophones. They don't even really work with urban francophones anymore because Quebec City has basically kicked out all the Liberals. They're getting, again, single-digit percentage points in Quebec City. This isn't even an urbanicity issue anymore. Because in the past, in like the early 2000s, you could say, okay, there's some urbanicity reasons here, right? That the Liberals are really good in cities, the Parti Quebecois does better in the rural areas, right? That's not true anymore. This has polarized really heavily on language. And I don't think that's going to change. Because here, I modeled this calculate these demographics, among Anglophones in Quebec, or sorry, Anglo/allophones in Quebec, the Liberals have 50% of them. Among Francophones, they have 7%. The Parti Quebecois gets about 11% of Anglo and allophones, and about 46% of Francophones. The CAQ gets 24% of Francophones and 11% of Anglo/allophones. Every other party's small enough that the difference is not that meaningful. That's kind of the world we're in. It's hard to imagine that difference changing, especially with the dynamics I'm seeing in the provincial Liberal Party, especially because the federal Liberal Party is losing popularity, and it seems very likely in the near future that they're going to fire, or Trudeau is going to resign, and he's going to be replaced by someone else. Now, I think this resignation will happen after 2025, but I think that will be a negative headwind going into 2026 for the provincial Liberals. Trudeau is relatively popular in Quebec. I'm not saying he's the most popular person ever, but Quebecers don't mind Trudeau. That's why the Quebec does quite well for Trudeau. The top contenders to replace Trudeau are people like Mark Carney, Chrystia Freeland, even names like Anita Anand or Sean Fraser. Those aren't Quebecers. Replacing the Quebecois leader of the Liberal Party with a different person, with an Ontarian or a Nova Scotian, that's not going to play super well. And I think it's going to be a negative headwind for the Liberals in Quebec, provincially, at the time when they need any positive movement, but they're not going to have it because they also don't really seem to have, from what I've seen so far, read, seen, heard, all those things, they don't really seem to have a good plan yet. Now, at the same time, they still are having their leadership race, I believe, so they don't need a plan just yet. But that is going to be challenging for them. Without a proper plan, they don't really have a path going forward. Whereas the Parti Québécois has a clear plan, and the CAQ has a clear plan. They actually have a clear, coherent vision to offer everyone in Quebec. They're just floundering right now because Legault screwed up too many times. And that's why I think replacing Legault would be the correct decision for once. I normally don't think you should replace leaders pretty much ever, but this might be the one case because I don't think it's the brand of the party. I think it's just Legault screwed up too many times. But who am I to say? And then to finally just wrap that out, Quebec Solidaire is going through a lot of really big issues too and a lot of trouble. Their co-leader resigned relatively recently, as a recording of this, and basically she was saying that she didn't feel like she was being listened to, etc., etc. And that leads into a big, hard to square problem with the Quebec Solidaire, especially with independent support rising over time. The leadership of the party is pro-independence, but the rank and file isn't. The rank and file are urbanite, usually allophone, Montrealers, a little bit of Anglophones, and a little bit of Francophones, but it's primarily urbanite Montrealers. You can see here where all their core base is. Those are the guys who support Quebec Solidaire for the most part. And it's young people too. Just to quote numbers here. Quebec Solidaire gets 30% of under 35s, but only 5% of 55 plus. They skew very young. But the problem with that is the very young group of the population in Quebec doesn't jive well with the rest of the province, especially this particular subsection of it. And I think it'll be very difficult for them to really gain much more ground when they're not speaking to primarily young, heavily university ridings. And it seems to be that's the case. They really are struggling to gain ground. They gained a lot of ground in the late 2000s, early 2010s, and then they just stuck. They're stuck where they are. They're kind of, in a sense, the Quebec version of the NDP. That's not exactly accurate, I know, Quebecers, but it's the closest thing for the rest of Canadians to really picture this. They're kind of like the Quebec NDP. They've hit their saturation point, and they kind of just waffle around at this point because they can't really decide what to do. They don't really know how to go any further. They don't want to water down their beliefs because that would be bad, and they don't really know how to appeal those beliefs to anyone else. They're kind of just stuck. Now, there is some potential, and this is the potential the NDP has been hoping for ages and ages. It hasn't come true yet, but this is still the hope. That since they do so well with the youth, they'll eventually do well. Because those voters will age up and still be their voters. But that usually is not how that happens, because voters change their beliefs as they age, and that usually means they go more conservative. That rule of thumb exists for a reason. I have a video on it, actually, which I'll link somewhere. But to summarize, Quebec's in a very interesting position. They have what appears to be multi-party democracy, but it's not. The concerns some people have that first past the post is really distorting things. In a sense, that's true, but in practice, not particularly, because the dynamics here aren't what you would expect. In a large sense of the term, if this was like a STV system, what we'd actually see is likely an increase in voter turnout for the Parti Quebecois and CAQ, such that they actually get more vote share than the rest of the population. That's my hypothesis. And also, it's splintered into a whole bunch of other different little parties too, but that's beside the point. The reason why it looks like this isn't because the electoral system, it's because the realities of what voters in Quebec want right now. They want someone who can reassure them that the Quebecois people, the Quebecois culture, will be able to thrive, won't be reduced and marginalized. That's what they want. Plamondon is offering that, at least so he says. Legault tried to offer that, but it didn't work out, and that's why Legault's failing. To try to summarize this down, point to certain scandals or certain positions or certain policies, it's not correct. And the reason why I can say that so firmly is we can look back to the pandemic when Legault was being the most autocratic, most authoritarian anti-COVID measures in the entire country, and Quebecers loved it. They re-elected him with an astounding majority, one of the largest majorities in provincial history, at least recent history. And why is that? It's not because Quebecers like that kind of government, per se. It's because in this atmosphere, this concern about the nation of Quebec, someone doing something feels good. It's reassuring. That's actually the ground back truth of why authoritarian governments come to be. They don't happen. You don't get a strong man because everything's going well. Strongmans emerge because things aren't going well. Everyone knows they're not going well, and no one else is doing anything. In the case of Quebec, Legault failed. He protected Quebec from COVID, you could say, in some sense of the term, at least spiritually, I suppose. I disagree personally, but that seems what the reality is. And now he's failed at the rest of it. Simple as. And he will likely finish out his term, unless he resigns and tries to pass off leadership. And then eventually a new CAQ leader will come in and will challenge Plamondon when Plamondon's been in office for 8, 12 years. And then that will happen somewhere else. Unless separation and independence happens, in which case it's a whole new ballgame. Because the CAQ and the Parti Quebecois only exist because they're in Canada. If Quebec could be independent, these two parties will explode immediately. And they'll probably form a normal left-right spectrum and not slow or fast-leaving spectrum. Well, with that, I bid you all adieu, and I will see you next week with something else.